Lost in his thoughts, Agesilaus was staring into the fire. Many were the things spinning around in his head, tough questions. Who he was, what he was about to do, what he was leaving behind, if he would manage it, and if he was strong enough to come out alive and unscathed through all this. It is said that the real value of a warrior is only visible on the field of battle, where the existential honor of one is measured with blood, and the material from which he is made with steel and guts, where the flame of heart and courage make the difference between a living victor and an unnamed dead. It was never your duty to die for your country. The opposite. Your duty was to kill the bastard you had opposite you, to make him die for his country. He had heard that countless times from his instructors, and finally, withdrawn from his youthful patriotic idealism, which commanded him that death for country was the most sacred duty, he realized that they were right. There was no glory in death. There was no honor. Only pain and a suck of blood and bones for those who were left behind. He was in a position to know it all very well. 11 years ago, his father Thersippus had died at Marathon. His comrade and childhood friend, Strato, had brought him back on one of the many carts the army had requisitioned from the peasants of Marathon to carry the dead back to the city. The body of dead Thersippus was stained with blood, puke, sweat, piss, and dirt. His armaments were scattered. His shield, the hoplon, which Agesilaus had watched him clean and anoint with oil patiently and methodically with such care, had dents and was broken. His armor had nicks and was torn where the spear of the enemy had pierced him, where his helmet was broken on the right side, while his helmet was broken on the right side, where the spear pierced him a second time. In that broken spot, half of his face was mangled where the enemy struck him, after piercing the abdomen. Agesilaus could not perceive any glory, as he was helping his mother and sister clean him with hot water and dress him in his best tunic for the next day. He did not find any glory in the modest house calls and the modest tears of the visitors who came by to give their farewells to his father and then left for some other house, some other farewell, under the sounds of lament that could be heard in the neighborhoods of Athens. He did not find this glory on the next day either, when the carriages of the state, loaded with about 200 dead, headed up to Marathon, so the Marathon fighters could all be buried together in the field of battle. Mainly, he did not manage to see the glory when his family sat down at the table again, and his father was not there. Perhaps it was the tears which did not allow him to see clearly. He remembered the turmoil in the city during the years and the months before the Battle of Marathon. The Ionian cities on the other side of the Aegean had revolted with the military help of the Athenian finger, and it was said that, as retaliation, a foreign king from the east wanted to conquer Athens, all of Greece, and who knew what else. His emissaries had come asking for earth and water as a form of symbolic submission, but had left empty-handed. Many Greek cities had decided that they would not fall without a fight, but those days, a few months and weeks before Marathon, were strange. As soon as its day's labors were over, the people would gather in the alleys and squares of the city, would stay up late, talking about what would be coming soon, tomorrow, the next week. The foreign king had entered Greek lands, they said. He had crossed the Hellespont. No, he had turned back after a storm that had crushed his fleet, in Macedonia. No, his fleet had not been destroyed and kept advancing, and before the might of his army the Hellenes were cowering and gave him the earth and water he was asking for. No, the Persian ground force had retreated. No, despite their differences, the Hellenes would not continue fighting themselves and would not remain neutral in the face of such an invasion. No, in the end the Persians were sending their fleet to blockade Athens. Know this, know that. As he was young at the time, Agesilaus did not really understand what exactly had transpired for what to come, for the invasion. In the years that would follow, his memories of that time were mainly of his father and his many friends, talking and scrutinizing every new rumor and new piece of news that reached the city, while the orange of the setting sun painted his memories with color, and a cool spring and summer breeze blew through the branches of the olive trees, in the fields where they worked, or in the street outside the house. He now knew what had happened back then with the Spartans, with his Agoras, Hippias, who had allied both with Persians as well as with the Spartans to retake Athens. He knew how close the state had come to give earth and water to the Persians so they would protect them from the Spartans, and about the cities on the coastline of Ionia, Eolis, and Doris, and in the island of Cyprus, which wanted to be free. Athens and Eretria had helped them with expeditionary forces, participating in their war against the Persians. He remembered that it must have been the beginning of spring of the same year, when his father had come back home one day and announced that the Persian navy had started sailing to his mother, Cleo. Months later, in the heart of the summer, while Naxos had fallen in the interim turmoil, the city was as if on fire. The Persians were in Ebia, they had taken Eretria, and war was knocking on their door. He remembered the moment of farewell very clearly. His father, wearing his full armor, standing in front of their house. His mother in front of him, looking him in the eyes as she was telling him the last words of farewell. His sister, Polixeni, only 9 years old at the time, hugging their father's legs and asking him not to leave, realizing that something bad was happening. Agesilaus had only just arrived, having spent the morning playing in the fields outside the city with Bion and some of their friends. Upon hearing news of the battle preparations, they all ran to their houses. Bion's father, Strato, was also wearing his armor and was waiting with his wife Electra for their only son to bid him farewell. Thursippus and Strato were childhood friends of the same age and neighbors. Their parents had also been neighbors, having lived in the same houses on the same street since they were children, and so a deep friendship connected them from old, as their houses were opposite one another. It made sense that Agesilaus' best friend would be Bion. Thursippus had taken his son a little further away to speak to him, perhaps for a last time, tell him things that were said between men, advice that was given in the final hour when the future seems so uncertain, words that some people would regret they never dared utter. In the following years, Agesilaus would thank his father, when he recalled those exact moments, for those words of his. And then, after the last farewell, Thursippus and Strato headed down towards the fields where the army would gather to start the march north to Marathon. The last image he had of his father was him walking down the road with Strato and both cracking jokes about how many slaves each Persian soldier would have to help him take a sit, or how hard it would be for them to lift the shield of an Athenian, being used to their own weaker ones. And 10 days later, Thursippus was dead, mangled in front of his house, brought there by Strato, who now had a black hole where his right eye once was, and 3 fingers were missing from his right hand, rendering him useless for a future battle. Thursippus' family was mourning. Strato's family were feeling for them and were following the lament for the loss of a good friend, a good neighbor, and a good comrade in arms. The eulogy Strato recited on the next day at the house's garden over the dead Thursippus did not soothe their untold pain. The oath both men had taken, for each to take care of the other one's family in case one of them was lost, seemed hollow to Agesilaus. Strato had kneeled before him and Polixeni, and had told them that he could not replace Thursippus, but he could offer his love for the children of his brotherly friend, and consider them his own children too. Soon, however, he himself realized that such words were not easily spoken in those hours. Blood and tears flowed from his eyes as he was delivering the eulogy for his friend. All their wounds were still too fresh. A few days later, Agesilaus had gone to find Bion in the fields under the olive trees near the temple of Artemis. Sulky, just like he had been all those days, he had carried with him the bent tip of his father's broken spear, and many times he would tear up when looking at the dried blood on it. Bion had sat next to him under an olive tree, and with his own crude way had explained the situation the way he saw it. It is not worth crying for him anymore. He is dead, gone. He will not know you cried, and your tears will not bring him back. So, just continue with your life the way he would do were he here, the way he himself would tell you to do. He smiled at him. One day, if you're lucky, you may get your revenge and paint your spear with the same color. So bad and terrible memories. The fires of military camps just before a battle were able to bring back many of those. It had been so many years, so many things had happened since then, but those days before and after Marathon had scarred him so much. He turned and looked around him to push away the black thoughts from his mind, to take it away from them. Bayan was again sitting next to him, just like back then, and was clumsily eating a piece of meat. Soon nothing would remain of the lamb on the fire, as hungry hoplites were gathering around the fires from all corners of the camp to break their fast. The battle would not be long, everyone was expecting it that same day, in a few hours. He took a small piece of meat from the ones the cook had already cut off and placed on wooden platters in front of them, and started eating slowly. He was not too hungry, quite the opposite. He felt his stomach a tangle, heavy with anticipation. Bayan, on the other hand, did not seem affected. A few minutes later, having eaten for 3 hoplites, he stood up, rubbing his belly with pleasure. He did not make a move to hide his morning erection, and he smiled complacently. "And now I'm ready to fuck Persians," he said loudly, and with a cheerful mood to all who were around, and then walked quickly to the area in front of the camp where the plain of the battlefield opened up. He gathered laughs and banter from every fire he passed, whereas some soldiers were looking at him stunned. He looked at the Persians, far in the horizon, on the other side of the river Asopus. He came to where the army would form up for the battle, half hoping that the Persians would see him approaching, stood there, spread his arms wide, and looked towards the Persian camp. "Persians!" he shouted to them. Did they hear him? Were they watching him? "This is how it's going to happen." A jet of piss spouted forth proudly from Bayan's erected penis, and he guided it this way and that. This was how he was showing his contempt. The Spartans would like it if they chanced to see it, the spontaneous and vile mocking of the enemy. Callinicus, who for his own reasons did not particularly like Bayan, whispered a question to Agesilaus whether his friend ever stopped in front of anything, whether he could be reined. Agesilaus replied with honesty that deep down, the man who was pacing with childish cheerfulness towards the Persians, describing with especially graphic words and moves what he would do to them, was a good man. Few were those who really knew who Bayan was. Yes, his ways seemed completely unrefined most of the time. In the few days that it took for the march from Megara to Plataea, Bayan had managed to become a beacon of interest for the Spartans. They considered it strange that an Athenian with good education and grown up inside the city of Usis, as they called it among themselves, would curse gods and men with such ease, be so nonchalant with others' opinions, not know politeness. The Spartans took pride that they were the most courageous in everything among the Greeks, and perhaps they were right, but they remained simple, stiff, and religious, and Bayan had a different kind of courage. It was either the courage of a man whose brain does not function properly, and does not correctly evaluate situations and actions, or the courage of a man who follows his instincts in every case. He had already formed friendships with a few Spartans, both hoplites and helots, and between them they came up with lewd jokes which spread like fire in the camp during those days they spent waiting under Kithaeron. "So we're in battle," was Bayan's newest joke. He had told it for the first time with a serious face on the previous night, in front of the fires. "Shouts, screams, panic, mud, blood. We have killed many Persians and we'll kill many more until the day is over. But at that moment, we see 5 Persians in front of us, coming towards us. How can we distinguish who is from Lydia, who is from Cilicia, who is from Medea, who is from a shithole much deeper in the east? Who among them is fresh, and who is the son of one who ate cock at Marathon and wants to get revenge from us?" "How?" a few soldiers who were listening asked, others with honest curiosity and others with sly grins planted by Bayan, having heard the joke earlier and wanting to help him tell it more effectively. "It's very simple. You can't," he replied seriously. Silence for a little while. "And you can't because the few who survived and went back described them everything, and so all of them will be coming ass first." The hoplites' laughs resounded loudly, and soon the joke started spreading and finding new ears, even the following morning. Agesilaus had smiled, but it was hard for him to joke about Marathon. It was where he had lost his father. Bayan had grown since the days of Marathon. Nowadays he was a bulky man of 22, older than Agesilaus by only a few weeks, but they had both grown up like brothers. As a result, Bayan's character did not annoy him. He had now gotten used to him. He knew that his friend, with his shameless tongue, was a source of constant troubles, as many were annoyed with the things he said. One of them was Callinicus, a young man of 19 years, very religious indeed, who took things much too seriously, especially everything that had to do with the gods. During the short march, Bion had made an offhanded comment about Aphrodite's ass while he was talking with another hoplite about the difficulties of the march, and Callinicus decided to take it upon himself to repay the insult. He called him with a nickname the Athenians had given him behind his back, people who were bothered by his rude behavior. He called him Procrustes, a name that implied that Bion was not a true Athenian and did not carry within him the classical Athenian ways. A mythical founder of Athens, Theseus, had killed Procrustes in his bed, and so anything that he represented, meaning the barbarian ways and the uncivilized, rude behavior. This nickname had been born after an observation by one of Bion's teachers at a table for a celebration regarding Bion's Procrustean speech, that he was a spirit of reaction, and that anything that was short he pulled to stretch, whereas anything that was long he hacked to shorten. Essentially, he brought everything he wanted to the size he desired it to be. Knowing, however, that Bion could easily start using that name for himself without regard, the comment had remained secret, and everyone who learned about it used it to mock him and make fun of him behind his back. Agesilaus had heard it once by accident, but had not really paid attention to it. He knew that Bion would not bother with it either. Callinicus mentioned it, thinking that he would insult Bion that way, he would make him feel ashamed. Instead, Bion started laughing and found it funny, and this bothered Callinicus even more. It was hard and rare for Bion to remain serious and reserved for long. He had within him a need to always speak his thoughts without really considering whatever reactions his words may bring. Watching him pissing and laughing towards the Persian camp, Agesilaus saw nothing that reminded him of his friend, as he was on that day in the gym. It was 5 years ago, at the time when they were both 17. Bion had arrived with a pretty bad mood at the gym, where they trained in Pancration, and had asked of Agesilaus to talk. He had not paid him much attention and had passively answered that they would talk later. Bion had repeated that he wanted them to talk 4 more times during the breaks, but Agesilaus kept ignoring him, trying to find a way to bring his friend down. At some point, Bion casually grabbed him by the neck with one hand, lifted him from his back with the other, and threw him down in the sand. Agesilaus did not realize how quickly everything happened, having only just had time to feel his neck being grabbed and his back slumming down. Bion stood over him. "I want us to talk," he shouted angrily. The other athletes training in Pancration in the nearby rings turned to look at them, fearing the fight was serious, but soon resumed their own training. Agesilaus, his back still in the sand, asked him softly what he would like them to talk about, and Bion crouched over him, looked him in the eyes, and spoke hoarsely 3 words. "About your sister." And then he walked with head bowed 2 meters further away and sat down in the sand of the ring. Agesilaus rose and also sat where he had fallen and started looking at him. The phrase could have been taken as a joke, but in a mysterious way it was not. Bion had shrunk himself like a small wounded child that had finally managed to bring out from inside him everything that was eating at him, and was trying to find a way to occupy himself to push away his awkwardness. He was scratching the sand and the dirt off his body, rubbing his hands, scratching his beard, sniffing his nose, looking everywhere right and left. He was ashamed. It was the first time Agesilaus had seen him being ashamed. "Do you want me to talk to her?" he asked him. Bion looked at him with an evident pain in his eyes. "If it is possible," he stammered hesitantly. He was telling the truth. Agesilaus had never seen him like this and never saw him again. Shame was an unknown word to Bion, but in that ring, at that moment, it was clear he was in love. Agesilaus had returned to his home feeling numb and had found Polixeni sitting in the garden reading Pentheus by Thespis. He described everything to her within the next 2 minutes, and she smiled, thanked him, and kissed him on the cheek before leaving to find Bion. "My little sister, who has suddenly grown up," Agesilaus was thinking as he watched her leaving. He found them walking together in the central street of Athens the next day, both smiling. He had lost himself again, staring into the fire. How fast time flew by. Bion came back to the fire in a happy mood. I cannot wait for the battle to start so we can sow a few bastards inside the Persians, he said loudly, so everyone around the fire heard him. Some laughed. Kallinicus was not one of them. You're being vulgar, Bion, he answered angrily. Bion stared at him with a surprised look, a look which suggested that he was trying to understand whether one of the camp's fleas had just talked to him. Well, the religious born just talked, he said. Did any of those goddesses to whom you pray come down to take your virginity, or are you still unfucked? Agesilaus sharply told his friend to stop, and he looked at him, understood, obeyed. Kallinicus was trying to contain his anger. You make fun of and curse the gods. Why do you do this? Do they not exist? Do you not see them around you every day? Bion laughed wryly. No, my friend, I do not see them. And yet, they were in Marathon so many years ago. Did you not hear about Pan, about Helios and his chariot, Apollo, Ares and Athena who appeared in the sky and fought next to the Hellenes? At Thermopylae last year, the Thunderer himself launched his thunder on the Calindramon on the second day and scared the Persians, or else Leonidas could not have lasted for so long. At Salamis, they raised many clouds, made loud noises, helped our fleet, and that's how we beat the Persians. Good. You can believe then that Zeus will be here to help us today, just like he helped Leonidas. I think that if he comes, he will just piss on us, judging by the clouds I see coming from the north. A few around him laughed. Wake up, Kallinicus. We will take the victory in this battle on our own. No god will place it ready in our hands, nor will one of those long-dead heroes rotting in a forgotten hole somewhere. To say that Theseus, Ahentleus, Heracles, Cinegyrus, and so many other heroes who came in the battle and fought next to our fathers, that they are rotting in holes, does not give you honor, Bion. But if we wait for a stupid farmer with a fucking plow who did not know the road to his field and who by luck found himself at Marathon to come here today and help us, we are doomed. As for Cinegyrus, because you mentioned him among the rest, my father himself told me he saw him dying on the beach with his hand cut off, and that he really did try to stop a Persian ship. Aeschylus, his brother, who was with him at the time of his death, described everything exactly like my father described it to me years later. Agesilaus is right here. He can tell you that he has heard both stories as we were together when we heard Aeschylus describing it outside of the theater once. And Cinegyrus was a mortal, Kallinicus. I had seen him. All of Athens had seen him. I remember him having a conversation with my father once at the Agora regarding the taxes, and men like him are who will give us a victory here. The rest that you mentioned, myths and fake stories, simply weren't there. Kallinicus was annoyed with his words, or perhaps even with himself for not having anything to say to such things, stood up, and after giving Bion a deadly stare, walked away. Bion nudged Agesilaus next to him and whispered, smiling, So how many wonkers are there in this camp? Agesilaus, however, was for once again lost in his thoughts. He had heard and talked about the horrible and strange things that had happened in Marathon for so many times, with Bion and other friends of theirs, to the point where the conversation did not interest him anymore, apart from the rare memories of his father that were coming back to him. He found himself watching a piece of white cloth that was tied around his left wrist. Bion saw that he was looking at it, and asked him if it was Iocastes. He nodded positively. He had fallen in love with her on the day of the Panathinaike Games 2 years earlier. From the first moment he had seen her, he felt as if he knew her from ages ago, as if he had seen her somewhere before, in a common past they shared. It was a strange sense, an eerie magnetism. She was a little shorter than him and older by about a year, but he did not mind that. Her sweet smile, her beautiful face, and her long brown hair haunted him right at that moment. He tried talking to her on the same day during the celebration, but she refuted him politely. Yet he was stubborn. Bion, who was also right next to him on that day, was watching him and laughing mischievously. He was eating an apple, and his mouth was full, when he told him to follow her as soon as he started drifting away to leave, as he was ashamed to be seen talking to a stranger, and was with her girlfriends. Agesilaus had listened to him and bided his time, following her in the alleys of Athens with his utter aim to call her from far away, see to turn back to see who it was, and then to ask her what was her name, as he didn't know it, and then he wanted to ask her if he could see her again, and then he didn't even know what else he would tell her, but he lost her in unknown neighborhoods. She had noticed him, had slipped away from him, and he had returned disappointed to where he had left Bion, who was biting the last of his apple. You lost her, huh? He asked him, and Agesilaus had nodded with a cringe. You will find her again. Matt's water had rolled under the bridge since then, however. He remembered the last time they were together, about 15 days earlier, on the days the Athenians had once again returned to their destroyed city, after abandoning it for a second time in a year. The army of the cities of the Alliance, the Spartans ahead of them all, had arrived in Megara that same noon to unite with the Athenian hoplites the following day, and then they would all march to Plataea. That same afternoon he had taken her by the hand, and they had gone out to the fields outside of the city to spend some time together, perhaps for the last time, as smoke was rising far to the north from burning fields and villages the Persians had left behind on their retreat. Few were the couples they met that afternoon in the fields on that stifling and grey day. As they walked, she stopped him and tied a piece of cloth on his left wrist. In order for it to stay clean, was her reasoning. The seal will protect it. It was a nice gesture. He asked her not to worry about him, even though he knew it was stupid to ask it of her, and she eyed him as if he really were stupid. He joked that she was still young and could rebuild her life if he didn't come back, but she was not in the mood for jokes and gave him a berating look. They sat under an olive tree, she inside his arms, and he gave her an affectionate kiss on the head. The silence around them reigned, and then she broke it. Do you remember how you tried to approach me at the beginning? You did so many funny things, she said. Yes, I remember. You got away from me on the first night, he replied. She started laughing. What was I to do when someone I did not know started following me in the night? I hid inside a side street and heard you leaving after a while, she said. But my favorite is still the whole thing you did with Homer's lyrics. Agesilaus laughed loudly. He had forgotten all about it now with everything that had happened those last 2 years. In the days after the Panathinaik Games, and with Bion's help, he had discovered from where Iocaste passed, and at what times of day. Every noon, as she was going back to her home with her girlfriends, who all lived in nearby neighborhoods, she passed through a street where a pedestal had been set up for orators who may have wanted to speak in public. 10 days after he had seen her for the first time, he had prepared a poem with lyrics from the Iliad that spoke of Helen's beauty, but had used her name, which Bion had made sure to learn and inform him of it in the meantime. He had stood at the right moment on that pedestal while Bion was sitting a little further away, trying to stop himself from laughing, and when he saw her approaching mindlessly and just before she passed in front of the pedestal, he started reciting the poem. She had looked at him with eyes wide, surprised, and he kept on with his recital, until an old man who had watched the whole scene shouted to Agesilaus not to steal from Homer so shamelessly. Agesilaus was caught off guard and gave a hateful glare to the old man, and Bion, who all that time was holding himself from laughing, could not stand it anymore. His laugh must have been heard in all of Athens. Agesilaus, embarrassed, looked at his friend who was holding his rumbling belly as he was sitting next to the pedestal, and then he turned his eyes to Iocaste. But she had vanished. A week later, Bion went and found him early one noon. He simply told him to follow him and guided him without a word to a part of the city they hadn't been in years, where the road never took them. Iocaste was there waiting for them, smiling. Agesilaus had lost his words, and Bion told him in a low voice that he should thank Polixeni and not to mess it up. He then patted him on the back and left. Agesilaus had approached her with a heavy gait, not knowing what to tell her, his mind empty of words. She spoke to him first, noticing his reluctance. I think you're a good guy, although a little clumsy. I would like to know you better. She gave him her hand. I am Iocaste. He took it and stuttered, embarrassed. His name. Shall we take a walk? She asked him, and he accepted. He remembered everything they had discussed on that day. He remembered they were talking until sundown, walking everywhere around the city. It was one of the happiest days of his life. He did not like the discussion they were having under the olive tree, but it had to happen. One day before leaving for the war, one final farewell, final memory, final union mixed with tears. Her breath was heavy with lust, and tears were rolling down her eyes, and he hugged her tighter to calm her down. I will come back, he whispered to her, and they stayed there, embraced, for hours. He walked her home that same night without them saying another word. The next morning, Iocaste was standing in front of his home, even though he did not expect to see her. She did not say a word, not even then. Final kiss, final embrace. The pain in his eyes was obvious and was saying everything that needed to be said. Bion bid farewell to Polixeni, serious. Cleo, Agesilaus' mother, talked to both of them, with Electra, Bion's mother, next to her, speechless on that day, heartbroken to live the same scene once more in her life. Strato was not there, having died a few years earlier from a bad infection in his lost eye. It is said the Spartan women told their sons to come back home with their shield on their shoulders or dead. We are not Spartans, however. Come back victorious, safe and alive, and let the seals fall and be cursed in Tartarus if need be, she said with a serious voice, struggling to contain her feelings. Walking down the same road that their fathers had walked 11 years earlier, the same place they had gone then, Agesilaus had stuttered. They had not turned to look at the 4 women they were leaving behind. It would not be right. Bion had tried to change the atmosphere between them, but he seemed affected as well. Women, friend, all they ever do is cry. I can't blame them, he answered. He was thinking of Iocaste and her tears. Yes, I guess they are justified, but I am happy and they should be happy for us as well. Where else will we find tight Persian asses again? Bion said, laughing. Agesilaus had smiled. He was glad that, in the battle to come, he would have his hopeless friend next to him. He would not want anyone else for a comrade in arms. He came back to the present again. The fire was still burning, and around him other soldiers started preparing themselves. A few hours later, the rumor that Pausanias was in the Athenian camp to speak with Aristides, the Athenian general, started spreading. He saw him as he was leaving, wearing his blood-red Spartan tunic, walking among them, with Spartan officers next to him. He stopped when he saw hoplites looking at him, asking him what was to happen, and he said a few words that they should all stay strong and expect new orders within the day, to be ready for every possibility. When he left, everyone looked around them to each other. Something was going to happen. They were expecting it. They were feeling it. The orders to retreat came in the afternoon. A retreat? Yes. The retreat was to be performed that same night because the army's supply lines had been attacked by the Persian cavalry, which constantly harassed them, and so the Hellenic forces would again head back to their earlier positions on the slopes of Kithaeron. As soon as the retreat was completed, the generals would evaluate the situation again. Agesilaus and Bion wore their armor when darkness came and sat again around the fire, where other soldiers were sharing various stories. Bion was trying to explain to everyone that this was the final battle, and then the Persians would not dare to come back to Greece. We cut off their balls in Salamis last year, and now only the dick remains, friends, he was telling them. We cut this off here, in this battle, we unmanned them, and we send them back to where they came from. I am certain we will win. I see it in the eyes of all of you, even in the eyes of that religious moron over there. Kallinikos was once again at their fire that night, and he simply smiled, unwilling to fight with Bion before the battle. Zeus be with you, friend, Bion told him. Kallinikos' smile brightened, and he wished them the same. The night was moving on, but the order for the retreat to commence was not coming. So many hours in full armor and sitting still, the bodies of many soldiers were starting to feel sore, and some had resigned and fallen asleep. Bion nudged the Agesilaus when everything around them had gone silent, and they were still awake, looking inside the fire. Polixeni is pregnant, he told him. He could not find words to speak. He could not describe his happiness. He could only feel it, like a small flower growing fierily inside him. They continued talking in a low voice, even while all around them the camp was waking up, and the horizon, the rising of the sun, signaled a new day. And then came the order for the retreat. because during the course of the night, the rest of the Greeks had silently retreated towards Kithaeron, as had been agreed, and now, in the light of day, all could see that a huge gap existed in the middle of the Greek battle line. The Spartans had not retreated either, and now stood with their Tegean allies on the right end of the line. They hastily gathered their items and started following the coordinated Athenian force that was retreating to the small town of Plataea. Had they actually failed? Half an hour later, shouts and screams started being heard from the back of the column. Agesilaus looked behind them, to their left, and out of the dust that had risen, he could see parts of the Persian army and cavalry attacking the broken Greek forces, coming straight to the Athenians and the Spartans further away. "Battle positions!" was heard from behind, or perhaps from the front, from the side of the town of Plataea, and they all started getting in line next to each other, taking their places. Bion grabbed him by the neck again, just like back then in the gym, and looked him in the eyes. "We are not our fathers," he told him, "and we will not become them. Give me your oath, and we will fight bravely today. We will win, we will live, and in 20 years from now we will be telling our children about this battle." Agesilaus agreed, heart aflame by the force of the moment, and gave him the oath he was asking for. They lowered their iron helmets, and their faces were lost, black sockets where their eyes once were. The restlessness around them was obvious, but Bion, always there with an obscenity in his mouth, gave heart to his fellow warriors. "The Persians have nice little asses, boys." A few scattered laughs resounded around them. "Fuck them good, don't let them slip away from you. The ones who get away will be telling everyone about the good Greek ways," Bion went on. More laughs, pushing fear away. "And Mardonius, with his swift and experienced Plummeas, leave to me," he said finally. Their chuckles were covered by the sound of the hooves of the Persian cavalry in its attack on the Athenian battle line. Agesilaus pushed with his shield on the back of the man in front of him, and felt the shield of the hoplite behind him on his own back. Next to him, Bion did the same, laughing loudly, drunk with warlust and rage, and he nodded to him. Agesilaus looked at the white piece of cloth on his left wrist for the last time. He did not know what would happen, but he had enough time to think of his loved ones, even for one final time, and to then freely offer wounds and steel to the enemy.